Good morning, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
I like your hat.
Thank you. I'm in the basement today. I'm getting a roof put on the house, so hopefully it's not too loud down here.
Well, always happens that my gardeners come. They never come on Monday except when we're doing this, and then they come. So we have a big agenda today, and unfortunately, while I was getting ready for it, I kind of went down the rabbit hole of John Vervaeke in his thing on Heidegger and Barfield, and I kind of got stuck in the first part of it on something because it connected up with what we were talking about last time.
Okay.
I wondered if we could just do that little piece before we jump into your diffusia thing about Barfield.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I'm going to play a little piece from John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, episode 50, and chat about it. We can chat about it for a minute. If I can figure out how to do this. Let's see, I need my desktop. And then I need Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Okay, here we go. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
The way Tillich resisted the Nazis. Because what Tillich talks about in The Courage to Be is courage. Now, he's careful to note that this is a kind of existential courage that ultimately allows us to confront and overcome meaninglessness in its depth, but also, of course, to more practically respond to, perverted responses to the meaning crisis itself, like Nazism and its Gnostic nightmare. This process of encouragement. Now, he is like Aristotle. He's not talking about something as simple as just bravery, facing danger, or fortitude, the ability to endure. No. For Tillich, courage is a virtue. There's something of wisdom in courage. Courage is involved within it, that central feature of wisdom, which is seeing through illusion into reality. The brave person faces danger, but that's all we can say about them. The person with fortitude endures difficulty, but that's all we can say of them. The courageous person sees through the illusion and the distortion of fear or distress to what is truly good and acts accordingly. So, what is this seeing through? And how does it help us confront the meaning crisis? So this notion of seeing through.
So I just want to stop there because I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier with how a baby learns to crawl and learns to walk by seeing the thing across the room that they desire and then running after it. Okay. And the way this all connected up in my mind was a story that I heard this weekend from a woman friend of mine. So let's go back to Vervaeke's question. He says, what is this seeing through into the depths? And look at this word courage and what it means, encouragement. It's the imparting of courage into a person. So even the word itself gives you the sense that it's coming from elsewhere. Now, of course, Vervaeke is not making that claim, but I think I'm making that claim. But so here's this woman's experience. She had been married for 10 years and they'd been struggling with infertility and had not been able to have a baby. And this called into question her whole universe, because what was her meaning? What was her purpose? If she couldn't bear children and she had this longing to have children, she had this great desire to be a mother. And as time went on and it became more and more apparent that she wasn't going to be able to have children, she was just internally shattered by this. And it was affecting her faith and everything else. And one morning she woke up and there were two thoughts in her mind simultaneously. And it wasn't anything she had thought up, they just arrived there. And those two thoughts were, God is good, his will for my life is perfect, always. And when those two thoughts sank into her consciousness, she realized there is a meaning and a purpose in this, and I can move forward with confidence into whatever my future is. And out of that, she created a way of using her musical ability to develop a kind of a concert that was based on the faith of composers in the past, and a way of talking about their faith while doing their music. And through a series of events, she became known for doing this thing, and now she has traveled all over the world and done this musical concert for thousands and thousands of people and had an impact on many, many people's lives. And it all arose out of that one day when she had that moment, okay? So to me, that tied up with what you said. I was so puzzled when I was talking about the baby and how, what is it that motivates a baby to try over and over and over again and to get rolled over so they can start crawling? What is it that motivates them? And you said wonder. And it took me a long time to percolate through that and realize what you meant by that. That sense of wonder at base is this sense that being is good. Did I get it right?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think there's a famous G.K. Chesterton quote where he says, "Gratitude is happiness doubled by wonder." And yeah, I think there's an essential goodness or a sort of childlike trust in the goodness of reality in that wonder. I think of, when you were talking about courage earlier, it made me think of, I think it's a C.S. Lewis quote where he says that, courage isn't just one of the virtues, it's every virtue at its testing point. And I think that testing point is a sense of, can I do what's right, and have this notion that in the end, doing what's right will lead to the best result. Can I trust that there is a good God that is working things towards a good end? And so I'm somehow participating with that goodness by choosing good here, versus actually there's this really screwed up, distorted reality that I'm a part of. I can't deal with things in a straightforward, honest way. I have to be crafty and deceitful in terms of how I engage with it, or I'll be overcome.
Well, so going back to Proposition A, that you can trust that there is a good end in store. Of course, that's not necessarily a good end for me. Even if I do the right thing, it may not turn out well for me, but the ultimate would be good. And I think that's what enables a soldier to have courage on the battlefield, because they're fighting for something larger. In order to fight with courage, they have to be fighting for something larger than themselves. Theoretically, that would be fighting for the freedom of their people or something large like that. But it also oftentimes works down to just the participatory fighting for the guy next to you because you care about him and you care about the team. But it always has to be something outside of yourself. Otherwise, you would just do what's good for you, right?
Yeah. There's some sort of connection and belief to a larger story. For sure. And too, I mean, it's a matter of timelines too, right? Because, even in this sort of frame where, you sacrifice your life in some way and it ends for you badly, in terms of the short term. It's a belief, this sort of apprehension and a fundamental goodness is that somehow it all weaves together into something more glorious based on your cooperation with what you perceive and know to be good and true. And so I don't know. I mean, like from a Peterson perspective, he doesn't, he's kind of skeptical about, there being something larger or deeper than the here and now in this sort of evolutionary history that we've undergone. And so like the best you can say is that you transmit something of your goodness into the next generation in a sort of Darwinian sense.
I'm not so sure he's as skeptical as we have tended to think him, because as I go back and re-listen to some things that he has taught, he's talking about very large mysteries that really cannot just arise out of evolutionary.
Yeah. Well, I think he's,
so forth.
He's more influenced. I think it's interesting in this De Fukia book where it shows how Barfield and Heidegger are kind of in some sense saying the same things in terms of this alternate philosophy and their connection to language. They're saying very, very similar things. However, Heidegger has a sort of he's trying to save subjectivity, but in the end he kind of destroys it because he doesn't have a place for the transcendent, and I think Peterson, he wants to be very careful with his use of language, which is part of, I think, what's made him so effective, but that he limits his speculations from what he'll say with any sort of confidence, which is, and again, why he won't affirm a propositional belief in God as such. He kind of hems and haws on that because he wants to limit his pronouncements to that which he can, absolutely kind of, which is no place for criticism or self-doubt. Like he will, and his account of how he wrote Maps of Meaning, he rewrote every phrase 50 times. I don't know if that's an exaggeration or not, but there's certainly some sort of thread of taking speech very seriously that kind of led him on his own autobiographical journey.
Well, let's hold on here with this idea of the propositional nature of whether he makes a statement of faith, that whether he's willing to make a statement of faith that's propositional. Because in this same John Vervaeke episode 50, he goes on to talk about Childlike's notion of faith, because that's what he's talking about at the very beginning of the video. And he says Childlike's notion of faith is not a propositional knowing, but it goes all the way back to the ancient Hebrew notion of da'af, which is a participatory knowing in a course of being as an aspirational process. And he said Childlike's notion of faith is that faith is ultimate concern, that which concerns us ultimately. And he quotes something which I think was Barfield. I don't think it was Childlike. And wasn't Barfield prior to Childlike?
Yes. Well, they're all around the same time, but like in terms of when some of their big ideas were published, Barfield's the early 20s. I don't know what the timeline is for Childlike.
So here's what he says is Childlike's notion of idolatry. You develop your ultimate concern as an icon through which you kind of articulate your sense of meaning. If you transform that into an idol, becomes an object to have or to possess or to control or to manipulate, you are thereby using the machinery that is appropriate to ultimate concern for something that is not ultimate. Now, I thought that was a Barfieldian idea, that idea about the icon becoming an idol if you start using it for something that is not ultimate, if you make something ultimate that is not ultimate. Wasn't that a Barfieldian idea?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's probably most, in its most elaborated form, it's in Saving the Appearances, which is it's interesting to me in looking at Barfield. I think there's lots of people that are kind of saying similar stuff. And what's interesting is because, again, it's this movement away from the Western sort of perhaps overemphasis on logos to this kind of larger holistic worldview. And there's always like some sort of invention or novel use of language to try and make that move back. And so, and because of that, I think, you know, a lot of these thinkers are talking about similar things, but they're not recognized in any sort of group. For instance, you know, Barfield was really influenced by Coleridge, who himself was influenced by some of the early German romantics who were reacting to Kant, who obviously he made the famous hard line between the noumenal and the phenomenal worlds, and kind of made it a sort of impossibility for, he kind of set the stage philosophically for modernism, because he draws that hard line between what we can know from the subjective point of view. And I think, you know, the romantics and then Coleridge and Barfield after them are all trying to regain a certain status to poetical language, and more largely speaking, the imagination itself as being in touch with something that we would recognize as truth. Now, again, it's not to say that it's truth in the absolute capital T sense, but it is a real truth that can't be apprehended through the simple propositional, you know, logical logos structure.
Well, what, hold on a second, I gotta shut this window.
Sure.
I knew they'd come. So this idea of truth as a structure, it's all contained there in what Vervaeke was talking about when he was discussing this idea of telos, that the ultimate is perspectival, participatory, aspirational, and open-ended, and it points toward the inexhaustibleness of the ground of being. And he talks about how you participate in an aspirational trajectory motivated by ultimate concern. And it just occurred to me, we got to get Vervaeke and Peterson talking to each other again, because the one time they talked to each other, and things I've heard Vervaeke say since then, he totally doesn't understand what Peterson is about and what Peterson is doing, because those
Agreed.
two are on a track side by side. So here's Vervaeke again. You participate in an aspirational trajectory motivated by ultimate concern. And here's Peterson. Fix your gaze on the highest good of which you can conceive and move towards it, and it will frame your available knowledge, resources, decision-making, and all of that. That's exactly the same idea. They're just using different language to talk about that idea. And so I want to pull up one of Peterson's things out of episode 12 of the personality, 2017 personality series, and look at this really quick.
This is the one going into Heidegger, right?
Yes, yes. And here he is talking for about 2 minutes.
It's a tougher one to explain. Disclosure of meaning, boss, the revelation of the object, the emergence of the phenomenon, the numinous. The very word phenomena is derived from phanes thai, to shine forth, to appear, to unveil itself, to come out of concealment or darkness. Okay, here's an example. You see someone beautiful. Your perception, or is it your perception, or does the beauty exist? That's the difference between Binswanger and Boss, because Binswanger would say, well, the reason that that thing appears to you as beautiful is because of the way you're filtering it. And Boss would say, no, the beauty is inheres in the object itself and manifests itself. It shines forth. And so I really like this concept, this concept of phenomena. That's why they're phenomenologists. Phanesthai means to shine forth. From the phenomenological perspective, you pursue those things that shine forth. Now, remember, this is kind of a parallel idea. I suppose it's a parallel of Jungian ideas. You remember in Harry Potter that when they're playing Quidditch, he's always chasing the snitch? And you remember how, if I've got this correctly, Quidditch is basically two games at the same time, right? There's the standard game and then there's the game that the seekers play. Yes? I've got that right? What happens if the seeker gets the snitch? Game's over, right? They win. Very interesting. It's brilliant. She has a brilliant imagination, that woman, Rowling. So the idea is that in every game, there's two games going on at the same time. There's the ordinary game, and there's the game that the seekers play, and the seekers chase the thing that shines at them. And that's what that little thing is, the snitch. It's a round circle with wings. It's a very, very old symbol. It's a symbol of what? It's a symbol of reality before it's fractionated into its parts. I don't know how to say it any more clearly than that. It's a symbol of what, imagine that there are things that move forward to make you curious. And you were trying to figure out what was common among all the things that made you curious. That thing that Harry Potter's chasing, that's a symbol of that. It's golden like the sun. It flits around and attracts your attention, and it's always moving. And if you're seeking, you chase it. So that's the phenomenological idea. That's the disclosure of meaning.
So episode 50 of the Meaning Crisis and episode 12 of the Personality Series are just, they're inching along, trying to get at the same thing of this relationship between meaning and reality. Because in episode 50 of the Meaning Crisis, he walks right into that relationship between meaning and reality. There's meaning, there's reality, and that which relates the two of them together, and that's this thing, right?
Yeah, well, right there in the phenomenologists, those two earlier phenomenologists that influence Heidegger, you have these two problematic elements. One says the beauty is in the object itself. The other says the beauty is, no, it's in your head. It's how you're filtering reality such that you see this thing. And what Barfield and Heidegger, to some extent, are both saying is that no, it's you're in this middle space between that phenomenological moment, that moment of meaning, of beauty, is the transjective, where the objective subjective thing collapses together, and there is a co-collaboration between you and the structure of reality.
Okay, is it necessary for the objective and subjective to collapse for that collaboration to take place, or is it possible for each of them to maintain their coherence, their individuality, and still have the space operating?
That's a great question. I mean, how you think about it technically, I don't know. I mean, like for both, Coleridge had this idea of polarity that Barfield kind of steals, so that there is this kind of pull from both angles, and that there's this sort of middle space where you cross some boundary that produces that felt change of consciousness.
Is that sort of like when does a number of grains of sand become a heap? When do you cross the boundary? Is it that kind of a boundary?
I don't know, but I mean, like, phenomenologically, you can say that you absolutely know it when it happens to you, right? It's a felt, that's where it's a felt change of consciousness. It's not like just like, okay, today I'm a little bit off and I don't really know why. It's suddenly...
Well, this is when the thing comes like this, like when you're standing in front of the painting and all of a sudden it comes into focus and you get taken up into the beauty of it. And
and maybe at first you're looking at the painting, you don't get it. And you're sitting with 5 other people and they don't get it either. And then for you, there's something in the object, but there's also something going on inside you, and the two of those things meet. And so and this is where that whole there's a self-disclosing act of reality that's making itself known to you, but there's a co-collaboration to be formed and to take note of what's shining forth as well on your part.
Well, so that's what Tillich was talking about with this method of correlation. Then this method of correlation was this idea of, I probably didn't write it down, but it's that very thing. And the way that John Vervaeke kind of simplifies it is to say, it's the same, almost the same language that Peterson uses. If you're seeking, it will shine out to you. You know, if you're looking for it, it will shine to you. So there's some sort of movement on this side and some sort of movement on that side, and they both have to be there at the same time for the thing to go into. It kind of reminds me, years ago there used to be this sort of art movement where people were creating these pieces of art. It was very clever. They would build into the art itself this inability to kind of perceive what was there, but if you looked at it long enough, it would shift into focus and then you could see what it was. In fact, there's some sort of sculpture on the edge of a harbor in some city that's all made out of wires. And if you look at it from a lot of different angles, it just looks like this jumble of wires, but there's one particular angle that you look at it and all of a sudden you can see this human form inside this jumble of wires, because the wires just sort of line up perfectly at a certain spot. And there's a way of doing art like that too, where you can just use a lot of different shapes and colors. And if you look long enough, it'll snap into place. But you have to desire to look long enough in order to see it. So it's that kind of thing where, you know, you were talking about being able to see beauty in other people, even when it's not obvious. But that requires that loving gaze, that long look, that you're willing to invest your time and energy into that. Okay, so that gives us a springboard, I hope, to move into your quotes from Diffusia. I don't know if it's Diffusia. Vervaeke says Diffusisia.
Oh, really? Is that how he said it?
Yeah. But I mean, he said it 3 different ways when he was saying it. One time he said Diffusia, one time he said Diffusia, and one time he said Diffusisia. One of the quotes that you had, which I thought I'd like to have you explain, was, words are like the DNA of human consciousness. I was trying to wrap my head around that. What does that mean?
Well, if you think about form as it relates to humans, there's this sort of interplay between kind of form and the expression of that form. And so I see within that space of words is a way for consciousness to kind of crystallize in a specific way that is transmissible from one consciousness to another. So it helps, and so it gives kind of like a milestone or this is where Barfield gets into this idea that words are kind of like fossils of consciousness. When we go back and look at what words used to mean and how they evolve over time, we're like looking back into previous modes of being as it relates to human consciousness. And so so for instance, when you just think of a particular word and how you use it, most of your interaction with that word is deeply subconscious, right? Because, you know, there's so much context around the word that the word just becomes a token for, right? And what we're doing at any given point is we're moving. So like, for instance, like you just use like maybe some adjective. I'm going to remember every single instance that I've ever heard that adjective, consciously or subconsciously. It's going to come into my frame, and it's going to give me indicators about what your potential meaning are. So like in that sort of way, and maybe you use it in a way that is completely new and foreign to me. And so there's an initial misunderstanding, but then I come to find out you actually meant this. And so that now shades my understanding of that word. And so we're all of us in our interactions with languages and books and through spoken words, we're all kind of shading the meanings of words. We're passing them back and forth, and never, we're always altering them every time we use them. I've also heard that this frame used of memories themselves, right? You can't remember, say, something that happened to you when you were 5 years old without changing that memory. So when I remember it now, whatever the context in that caused me to remember it is going to now be tagged to that as well. So I'm going to change that memory slightly. That's why memories are, like eyewitness testimony even isn't super reliable, because it's very easy for a smart investigator to tinge your memory in a certain way so that you recall events in a way that helps their case. This has been shown over and over and again. You can give somebody a false memory of somebody by just showing them a picture that's been doctored, and they will kind of fabricate the rest around it. So like memory is always a sort of construction. There's some structural component of it that is actually, a structure that's, in your brain, but then it's such a compressed structure that you recontextualize it as you bring it back into your current consciousness, and in your current consciousness has all this other context, and now that context becomes altering of that particular memory. And so the same thing with all these words. They're kind of like placeholders. They're little tokens that have keys that unlock certain parts of your brain, but it's a very complex structure, and you're changing it every time you use it, and you're altering in other people as well. And so I think that's what I meant by DNA, right? So it becomes the sort of structural component of what we can look at as an indicator of these changes of consciousness over time.
Okay. The structural component of and say that again.
Right. So like, simply put, I mean, I'm probably shading it too much with unnecessary language, as Barfield puts it.
This because this ties up to so many levels of things. I mean, just on the simple level, years ago, I used to have an 1828 Webster dictionary. I loved that thing because when you go back and look at what words meant in 1828, and then you read like the Constitution or the Federalist Papers or something like that, completely makes better sense. Or even just reading the King James Version of the Bible, when you look at what words meant in 1828, helps you way more than looking at a dictionary today, because words mean something so much different. Here we are almost 200 years later.
Right.
So that's just on a very simple level. On another level, looking at Jordan Peterson's episode 12 of the personality thing, when he started talking about us as persons and Heidegger's idea of the Dasein, how, and it's kind of like this picture I had years ago of our experiential DNA. Everything that I've experienced, everything I've thought, everything I've read, all that's in me. So Peterson's using this example of if you have a fight with your mother and it's the same fight you've had 50 times before. Well, that's interesting. Why have you had this same fight 50 times? Because every time you go into this fight again, all 50 of those fights come into this fight with you.
Right.
While you're dragging along all these tin cans are tied to your tail, coming into every encounter. So it's like the past is folded up into your present, and then the future unfolds out of this present. And so I think that's what you're saying about the DNA, because the DNA is all folded up into where we are today. And if we're to believe all this stuff about epigenetics and everything, today and the future can also get folded up into the DNA, and the DNA is always like moving like that, right? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. What's interesting too about that example about the fight, I think that's interesting, is it also shows why it's not super useful to try and figure out who's at fault. Because again, like to figure that out, you have to go back to the very beginning of your relationship, because everything you do is in this sort of dynamic, right? You do something, I respond to what you do, you respond to what I do, and it's like this forever dance. And trying to figure that out is like, well, who is responsible for the thing I did when I angrily shut the door yesterday or something like that? Well, it's too complicated, right? And so I think this is where that phrase aspirational becomes so important in terms of what we're looking for. You have to have this sort of telos or future in mind, this sort of highest point that you're, and it's in terms of future orientation and where you go from now, trying to figure out how you got exactly where you are now before you, and who's at fault, and assigning blame, and doing a sort of arithmetic, try and or claim to do that is just super unhelpful, because it's just too complicated for us to deal, even in a very simple relationship with just two people, let alone where you magnify this to millions of people.
You're saying the telos and the higher point that you're aiming at, is that when Peterson's talking about like aiming for peace instead of aiming to win, or instead of aiming to prove you're right, aim for peace? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I think.
I mean, at some point, keeping short accounts and keeping things cleaned up on a regular basis is kind of important, because otherwise you're just enabling this pile of tin cans to keep dragging after you, right? You have to, ideally, in every conversation, you would try to get the clearest possible communication without preconceptions about the other person and what you think they're thinking and how you'd like to accuse them, or you have to keep all that stuff out of the way so you can keep it pristine as possible. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you get to the place where you just have to shove everything under the rug every time you have a conversation in order to maintain peace. So
well,
that's what I'm never sure about when he says, aim for peace. Well, yeah, that's what Chamberlain always said. But if Chamberlain had remained in office, then Hitler would have ruled the world. So
yeah, it's a super tough one. It's something I think about a lot. And I think your aim is to, both from a Petersonian perspective and from a Christian perspective, is to make yourself maximally responsible for as much as responsibility for things being wrong as you can. And that's hard to do. I don't think you should, and it's a fine line to know, okay, well, at what point are you enabling somebody who's just got bad behavior? And so it's a tough thing to do. And I do think, the love isn't just mercy, it's also some justice. Every relationship needs both. But yeah. And oftentimes the way you can figure out whether justice or mercy is required is ask yourself which is going to cost you more.
Well, I think this is also where boundaries come in. Henry Cloud has done a lot of work on relational boundaries and how important it is to have a personal boundary. and know what is your responsibility and what is not your responsibility. So if you're in one of these fights, you know, Peterson has, I love this thing. He talks about if you're having a fight with your wife or your husband, make a decision to go into your corners and spend some time thinking, what have I done to contribute to this problem? But each person thinks through their own contribution to the problem. And then you come back and you confess what your own contribution was to the problem, but you have to be very honest about it. You have to really take a look at yourself, be as maximally responsible as you can for what you've done wrong, and recognize where you bear the weight of what has happened. And maybe it's even a bigger thing than you thought, but you still have to be honest about it. But if you start assuming responsibility for the other person's problem, then you're stealing their agency, basically. You're stealing their opportunity to grow, their opportunity to see their own path.
Yeah. All this has to be enabled by truth.
Yep.
Because depending on your personality, it might be really easy for you to lay down the justice. You know, you just live to tell the other person where they're wrong. But you could just as easily be tempered such that it's very hard for you to do that. You know, and you're much more likely to just go full mercy because that's easier for you temperamentally. And so it can be difficult to just say, hey, you know, here's where I'm getting it wrong, but here's, you know, where I think your contribution here is needs to be altered.
Yep. So there were some other quotes in here that I had kind of hard time wrapping my mind around because I don't have the Diffusia book, but I thought I would put the onus on you.
Sure.
Barfield's hallmark as a philosopher has been his use of grammar and semantics to support his metaphysics. In a period where philosophers usually employ linguistic analysis to discredit metaphysics. What does that mean?
Well, it's Barfield. His oldest work was History of English Words, so that's where he embarked on this sort of exploration of the history of language, and that gave him this idea that when you go back in time with language, it becomes more and more metaphorical. And so that, again, it's this combination, and the metaphor is always joining things together that are they're unlike, you know, it's filling in these sort of gaps in the scientific image and the logical, you know, prosaic or philosophical point of view of the left brain. It's putting things together versus kind of taking them apart. And so that for Barfield, you know, this language becomes a sort of basic structure of reality, you know, and he didn't put it this way. This is Heidegger, but, you know, Heidegger says, you know, being in some sense is always sane, because it has this structure of meaning folded into it. So there's always a sort of measurement of meaning at any level of analysis that when you're investigating reality. So there's this sort of, so language is so fundamental for both Barfield and Heidegger that it gets into their ontology. It is in some sense the real structure of reality. And so I think that the point being made there is that again, the difference is for most people, like from Kant onward, is they see the inner workings of the mind as disconnected from the cosmos, whereas the older perspective was always that, you know, Aristotle looked inside of animals because he thought the way they were structured and held together would be illuminating of the cosmos at large. And we've since, you know, it started before Kant, but Kant made it very sharp in terms of the philosophic mind of these two, the noumenal and the phenomenal, being divided. And so from then on, any sort of appeal to language and grammar was appeal to the kind of brokenness of subjectivity.
Well, so before we move on with that, I would like to discuss just momentarily what Vervaeke is talking about at the end of episode 50, where he said he's taking exception with Barfield's idea. And he says the thing he doesn't agree with Barfield about is this idea of the evolution of consciousness, because he says, and I think maybe he's saying this because he misunderstands Barfield, but my own grasp on Barfield is so tenuous that I would hesitate to accuse him of that. So I'm just going to throw out here what he said and see what you think about it.
Sure.
He said that Lakoff and Johnson, is that their names, that were doing work on language more recently, that they talked about words like grasp or attack or see as being words that have become more filled with meaning, not less filled with meaning. So, for example, you can attack something physically, but you can also attack something through argumentation. You can see something physically, or you can see something inside your own, you know, imaginal perception. You can grasp something as an idea, or you can grasp it with your hand. That we have kind of exploded words and developed larger meanings for them that actually grows the meaning of words rather than shrinks them. And so he was saying that he thought Barfield was wrong. But I thought that that was kind of a misunderstanding of what Barfield is talking about, when he, because it seemed to me when Barfield is talking about original participation, it was more like, it wasn't as though language was something that men made up to describe what they were seeing. It was as though language was something integral to humanity, so that words had a meaning that was completely integrated with our human person.
Yeah.
That the words came from inside out, not outside in. Am I over reading? Am I putting too much into Barfield?
Well, I mean, so Barfield sees language as, again, fundamental to reality. He makes the statement that asking about the origin of language is asking about the origin of origin. I mean, and he's almost connecting all reality, like, again, as Heidegger does, to this. There's this sort of language in the universe at writ large, so that you could easily connect that to, you know, the Kantian creation of God speaking creation into existence. And so for Barfield, he sees that language is given, and that it's given in this state where it connects all these realities together, the spiritual and the physical. And he would hold up examples like pneuma, where you have a single word that means spirit, wind, and breath, all the same things. And his claim, and this is something I've thought about, I don't know that this is true, it'd be interesting to do a more thorough investigation of, is that the further back in time you go with language, that the more that words get longer and have these kind of more inclusive, like larger meanings, that which is the alternate theory, is that like we have words that mean very simple things, right? That like that we like, you know, the idea is a bunch of apes are sitting in a circle and they all make a grunt and pointing at a certain object, and now that sort of grunt becomes a representation of that object, and then over time, you know, it evolves to mean something spiritual. But if you go back, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because you go back in time and you know, ancient man was much more spiritual than us today, and the words they used were all inclusive. Now, of course, we can't go back before there's written documents, right? So there's a whole unrecorded portion of history that we don't have access to. But I don't know enough about philology to comment intelligently on whether Barfield's right or not. He did his own investigation in histories on English words, where he goes back into some of the Proto-European roots of English words, and this is the conclusion he took away from that. But it's funny, today I was actually listening to John McWhorter. You're probably familiar with him from some of his talks with Glenn Rowley, but he's a professor of linguistics, and he has on Audible, there's a great courses series where he goes through the history of language. So I'm interested to take a more academic approach to diving into that subject to see in what ways Barfield's right or not. Certainly, I think, I mean, you can see that certain words can also grow over time. But what I think has been more common in the West is that words become more particular, and we kind of lose a lot of the richness of words. We forget the alternate meanings of words and use it in a very kind of uniform way.
I thought, I mean, what that makes me think about is when Vervaeke makes this really interesting statement that science, or maybe it was Peterson, one of them said that science is the process of removing meaning so that you can objectify something in order to study it. That you have to remove layers and layers and layers of meaning from something in order to hone in on one aspect of it, in order to set up a scientific experiment to study that one aspect, because otherwise there's the combinatorial explosion makes it impossible. So
yeah, I mean,
so by its very nature, science is removing meaning, and we have become more and more scientific over time. So naturally, we must go through that process of particularizing on our language as well.
right. Well, I think it's because meaning is always about the way things fit together. It's always at this larger scale is where meaning exists. And so, you know, science is always working at the margins to give us a more precise look at something. So whether you're talking about like a telescope or a microscope or other tools of inquiry, we're trying to zone, like, look at one little slice of something to the exclusion of everything else, and try to remove all the connections to larger reality, because those will interfere with the sort of simplistic cause and effect types of inferences I'm trying to make in test, right? So I'm trying to get everything outside of, remove it temporarily for the purposes of experimentation and empirical observation. And so I think even science, though, to work well, it still has to be integrated back into some holistic thing. But we've sort of mistaken what we do when we kind of zone in and narrow in on a certain slice of something, and the precision we get there, and think that that same sort of precision can be writ large, that we can use that same sort of process to make some sort of conception of the whole, which I think, again, what Barfield and Heidegger are pointing out is there's something completely different happening in that mode of seeing and being. That's completely different.
Well, so you were, just a second ago, you said meaning is always about how things fit together.
Yeah.
And that was really, really helpful, because in Peterson's Personality 12, when he's talking about curiosity being that which pulls you forward, he's talking about how curiosity is so idiosyncratic. A number of people can all be looking at the same set of circumstances, and each person would have a different thing in that field of interest that would grab their attention, and they would want to follow after that. So that's a very mysterious thing, right? Where is it taking you? Where does it want to take you? What is it that creates curiosity? But he talking about pathology, and he says it's not random. If you see meaning everywhere instead of just in this one thing that is curiosity, seeing meaning everywhere is the hallmark of schizophrenia. It's how you end up paranoid, because you see too many patterns, right? That's when you get into the whole, we've talked about this before, you get into the whole conspiracy rat hole. But meaning is not getting spread out everywhere. Meaning is always about bringing things together. These are the things where, when I listen to John Vervaeke try to talk about these things, and when he talks about the inexhaustibleness of being, and he talks with such beautiful language about meaning and reality and all of this, and yet he's not, he's just not, it's so frustrating. When he was talking about the inexhaustibleness of being, and that Childlike is positing a non-theism, because he's frustrated with theism, with literalism, and with fundamentalism as being inadequate, because they make being into an idol by making God into some sort of thing. I mean, because a theist would say God is person. He's not just force, or just, I think Childlike uses the word no thingness. There's a no thingness about God. But I personally don't understand why both things can't be true at the same time. That there is a no thingness about God because of the apophatic move of he is always more. It's always more than we can express about any aspect whatsoever. And at the same time, there must be a personal aspect. Because if you don't accept the personal aspect, then it seems to me that you're seeing a force, something that you can manipulate, something that you can use, something that you can put into service for you. But when you recognize the personness of God, then you have to contend with, there's a relationship here. Where am I in relation? Well, I'm way down here and he's way up there. So that connection is a relational one. And at the same time that he's way up there and I'm way down here, he is coming down here and picking me up and bringing me back up into himself. So there's always this move going on. But that necessitates being able to see him as a person. And that's the thing that John is always backing away from.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting move, because you're making claims about, how inexhaustible this thing is, and how unapproachable it is in its totality, and yet you're wanting to make certain categorical claims about it in its totality. It's not a person. Well, if you just made the move.
I saw what you did there. That was great.
Yeah. Well, and this is something of what Kant did as well, when he separated those two phenomenal things, because he puts all these transcendentals like reason and goodness and truth on this other side that you can't get out of the subjectivity he describes. But then he goes on in all his books to talk about them as if he's talking about, stone cold truth. It's like, well, but you just by your own philosophy placed it out of your reach. So what are you actually doing now? Are you making meaningful statements? You seem to think you do. You're spending quite a lot of time doing it. So you seem to think you're in touch with some reality, but you've just sundered the mechanism whereby those two realities can be connected. And I think at the very least, you have to, for the infinite to manifest itself to the finite, the infinite has to make some move. For that compression of that level, there has to be some move on the part of the infinite. It seems pretty definite, and that's where people really hem and haw, because there's motivational reasons to not want to have to deal with this very large person that has and again, even if you deal with that person in an imaginary context, it's the idea of this person that knows everything about you and knows all your secret motivations for the things you've done, even that you at the time thought you were, proclaiming your own virtue by, but really you had some, ulterior dark motives for. The idea that there's somebody looking at all those things and kind of has an opinion on them. It's a heavy weight to try and conceptualize and interact with, and I think people would like to cast it aside.
Well, if I just look at it from the standpoint of information, it seems perfectly understandable from a scientific point of view or technological point of view.
Right, to kind of temporarily dispense with it while you're doing this quote unquote scientific thing over here where you're purposely narrowing your frame.
Well, that's exactly what I mean. What I'm saying is this idea that some person or some entity can know everything about me.
Mm-hmm.
If I can separate myself from my own intimations of my importance or whatever, and thinking of myself as some unique, contained consciousness and all that, and just think of myself as being composed of information.
Okay.
Everything about me is just information. If Google could have tracked every one of my thoughts and inclinations and everything from the time I was born, Google would have this database of who I am, all my experiences, all my relationships, all of that. So let's just say I'm just composed of, I'm an entity of information, you're an entity of information. The space between us has a certain amount of information in it because it shows whatever interactions we've had and what distance you are from me. So it's just information. Now think about, we've talked before about how everything has a boundary. Well, so as I see it, I think that the boundary of the universe must be time, because the universe is as big as it, at any moment in time, the universe is as big as it is based on how long it's been expanding. So time must be the boundary of the universe. And then you think about how information and entropy relate. And as the universe is expanding, the entropy is increasing because as it expands, there's more space between everything, which means there are more probabilities, more possible configurations of every particle in the universe. So this entropy is growing all the time. And that means that the amount of information is always increasing as well. So there's a constant increase in information. And of course, as each of us grows from babyhood onward, we're a constantly increasing body of information. So the being that started all of this and when C.S. Lewis talks about him being the whole show, and I'm not saying pantheism here, I'm just saying that all of this is contained. He is above and beyond, and all of this is contained in him. So in a sense, and this sounds really clinical, but this body of information is part of who he is. So it's not something that he has to have secret access to my inside to understand. That body of information is part of who he is.
Right.
Right?
If
I mean, to me,
all
it's not
these
hard to get.
if all these molecules move in the particular patterns that they, precise patterns they move in because he suffers or permits them to, then yeah, that's, and I don't know if it matters ontologically whether it's exactly in him or if there's some degree of separation. It doesn't matter. Like you said, I think he certainly has moment by moment access to it all.
Can we look at that word suffer for just a second? Because we talked before about how the word passive comes out of that word passion, which has this meaning of suffering or permitting.
Mm-hmm.
When Peterson was talking in episode 12, he was talking about our perceptions. And I thought this was so interesting. He said, your perceptions are not passive, they're highly active. And the example that he used was our vision. We tend to think that our vision is kind of passive, we're just receiving signals. But he said, in actuality, your vision is always in constant motion. Because if your eyes weren't constantly, minimally darting all the time around, they wouldn't be refreshing the information and getting all the new information as it's needed. So there's actually a high degree of activity in our perceptions. They're not passive in the sense that we usually think of passive as being just laying back and letting it happen, like going into car wash mode and just letting it wash over you, right? That's not what passive means. Passive has this implicit, and he doesn't say this, but I mean, this is the way it seems to me. There's an implicit connectivity that passive perceptions are actually a constantly connecting with this thing that's out there, the curiosity. And to me, that's the curiosity, the anomaly, the thing that's out in front of you. That's how we get the new information about ourselves and about the source of being and all of that. It's coming through that lens, that frame, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both are happening simultaneously. There's the active and the passive in the sense making. And I think you could roughly divide those up into this sort of that whole justice and mercy dynamic as it relates to love. Because there is a sense in which when you're looking at the world, you are chopping it up and putting it into bite-sized increments so you can ingest it. But then there's other parts of you that are suffering and taking it in and reconfiguring your internal configuration so as to permit or suffer this new outside being to become part of your being. And you're doing both all the time. And it's I think this is a big part of when we say what wisdom is deciding how much to go one way versus the other at any given time. What's the correct mode of perceiving? And I think perceiving, because it takes place before everything else we do, it frames everything else. It's such an important part of being. How you perceive it, something will often dictate how you act, or what you perceive to be what you think is the right thing to do. So it's super important.
So what aspect of Diffusia's work did you want to talk about?
Well, I find that the whole taking this back to Kant, I found really interesting. There's this guy Frank that he keeps quoting over and over again in reference to these early German romantics that influenced Coleridge and influenced Barfield. And I'll just read a quote from this. It says, he labels this romantic, quote unquote, longing. There's this famous quote of philosophy as the finite longing for the infinite. He says this romantic longing that moves the finite toward the infinite as a coherence theory. That is, quote, not as foundations that are given, but rather as foundations that appear in, quote, the connection of all particular things with the whole. And so this is trying to get out of that mode of subjectivity and or objectivity and put us back in this sort of middle place where we're in touch with truth to a real degree, and we have the real possibility of progress towards the infinite. But the new modes, the new layer of progress we make isn't like hitting this sort of bedrock or foundation of reality itself. That's still at or removed from us. Like, we can watch the quarks do what they're doing, but we don't know what the inside of a quark is or what its essential nature is. That's still hidden from us. But what we do have the progression in is this sort of coherence of things. And I think that's where we experience beauty. That's where we experience a new sense of meaning, is in a new revelation in terms of how all these things and how the particular of what you're experiencing now is connected to the whole.
Well, so
And that,
what did you mean when you said that Kant was it Kant or Heidegger, in attempting to save the subjective, actually disintegrated it? I mean,
this is, because for Heidegger specifically, he makes the subject so passive. You're not a co-collaborator. It's just kind of happening to you. You're suffering it all. Like, whether you realize it or not, you're completely determined by being and it's saying towards you. And so, like,
okay,
your subjectivity it's funny because he's trying to put subjectivity back in touch with the noumenal or the or reality as such, but in doing so he just obliterates it, because it's now there is no agency, there's no choice you're really making. You're just kind of you're being overwritten by reality itself as it speaks into you.
Okay, well, so Peterson was talking about that at some point he was making the point, and I think it might have been his own point. I don't think he was quoting anybody. He was saying that it cannot be true that the subjective does not exist, because the objective would not exist without the subjective. That an object only has the meaning, only has the context given to it by the subject. So
right, which
every
is why
object has so many different potentials, but it's nothing until it's looked at by somebody. And he said, now I don't want to make any quantum analogies here, but I mean, that's true, right? I mean, even one of the examples he used was an envelope that comes in the mail, with just an envelope. But if the envelope holds your MCAT scores, and that means inside the envelope is every dream you've ever had for your future and every retribution you've ever had about your past, then that object has infinity of meanings possible to it. So,
which this is why the postmodern critique of modernism is essentially correct, right?
yes.
This view from nowhere doesn't exist. This idealized objectivity is not a place you can actually go and visit. You know,
Okay,
everything.
So then take me back to what this Frank said about the finite longing for the infinite, because I'm trying to understand this relationship between the subjective and objective in these guys' minds, and that's why I brought that up. I might have taken us off track a little bit, but I want you to go back and talk about that again. That philosophy is the finite longing for the infinite, and then you were talking about how the subjective and objective fit into that.
Right. So let's see if I can find this quote. So again, the early German romantics are reacting against Kant and trying to regain, and they're kind of, Diffusia makes the kind of observation that they're kind of outside the stream of where the Western intellectual mind is going. So they're kind of all shuttled off to the side, and their philosophical contributions are kind of not even looked at, because they're reactionary to what Kant says, and they're trying to put things back together. And there's this, let's see if I can find it. And really, this is where for Barfield, that it's all about, he likes to go to poetry because for him, it's all about language, and poetry for him is this sort of mode of consciously being aware of the inexpressible nature of reality, and yet still endeavoring to do so with words. And so it's a sort of mode of being that is essentially iconic, right? Because it's aware that these words are just tokens to some greater reality, and it has no pretense that the prosaic language has of being objective. It's intensely subjective, but the idea being for Barfield that it's operating in this middle space, or attempting to, at its best, it's uniting these two things together, the subjective and the objective. Let's see. Oh man, I can't. Wait, this is a decent one. This is a further elaboration of that, the finite longing for the infinite. The repositioning of the infinite indicates that being thus cannot be fully comprehended by consciousness, and therefore must be delivered over in the aesthetic experience through beauty and art. The beauty of art enables us to experience something whose meaning cannot be exhausted by thought, and hence helps us to comprehend or grasp being, although never exhaustively. To be clear, this is not to be understood as an aesthetic sundered from the realm of philosophy, but rather it is here that philosophy is brought up by poetry. In the same way the finite always already points beyond itself, so too poetry grasps the infinite in and through the aporias of philosophy. Aporia just means the contradictions. Here, the imagination mediates between the finite aporias and infinite by drafting an image of that which is otherwise unrepresentable. So again, you can see that sort of iconic. There's a certain always already conscious awareness of this is unrepresentable, but I'm still going to craft an image that points to it.
So that's the move that like the Orthodox make in creating the icons, because they recognize that the icon is just a window, just a portal. It's not meant to represent the thing at all, but just to open an opportunity to think about what is beyond that. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, and the detail of the icon matters extremely, right? It's compressing so much into such a small little slice of time and space, and yet it's not an end in itself, and anyone who makes it an end in itself has already kind of sundered himself from that larger reality.
So that's what's happening right now with the whole statue thing, right? Because a statue of Thomas Jefferson wasn't a statue of Thomas Jefferson. That statue of Thomas Jefferson was there to point us to the ideals that he represented and the historical traditions and foundation of our nation and the Constitution and all that that represented in terms of bringing people together and gathering ideas and all of that. But for the person who tears that down, it just represents Thomas Jefferson with all his failings and all his weaknesses and all the things that he did that weren't correct. And
Yeah.
wow.
And you could make the point that the icon needs updating, right? But you gotta substitute it with something else. You can't have this endless critique as the new mode of being. You can't build a new unity based on deconstruction of the past. Like there's that group identity that's built on that they'll kind of rip each other to shreds, right? There's got to be something positive and centering that is an ideal, that is aspirational, one which is high enough that we can't exactly reach it, so that we can't pretend, to be, so that we have an ideal that's high enough that it can actually judge us in terms of where we're not measuring up to it.
Well, and this goes back to being willing to be maximally responsible for your own failures and shortcomings. And I don't remember who it was that I was listening to the other day, but they put it much better than I could, talking about the problem with people who are placing all these judgments on the founders is that they're not looking at where they would have been back then if they were faced with the same context and the same situation that was going on around them. How are they to say that they would have been the great hero in that moment and would have been the one who could stand up to the crowd and talk about what was right? Instead, they can stand on the perch here and look back with, judgment and moral superiority, and then none of us know how the future is going to judge us. They're going to look back on us and they're going to say, "Oh my gosh, those people were eating animals," or whatever they might decide to look at. With they were burning coal to make electricity. They were monsters.
Yeah. It's world's a very complex place, and we are always having to hide that in ways that are both counterproductive and productive, and trying to shuttle between what the trade-offs are, and it is difficult. We certainly have lost a certain center in a country the size of the U.S. For what we could unite around. So
well,
it'll be interesting.
Jonathan Peugeot was talking the other day about, I think it was Jonathan, talking about the biblical concept of hiding the nakedness of our forebears. And he used the illustration of Noah, who is the forebear of all of us, and how one of his sons, saw his nakedness and did nothing about it. And the other two sons went in and covered him and, walked out backwards. So they, they walked out backwards so they wouldn't see his nakedness. And that's exactly what we have to do to find a way to move forward, is to look back on our forebears with some sense of gratitude and hide their nakedness to a certain extent. See how much of that nakedness we need to uncover in order to improve, but at the same time hide the part of the nakedness that has to be kept covered. There are those things with honor and those things without honor.
Yeah, I think the modern mind would if somebody stumbled into one of Jonathan's Peugeot's videos and they stumbled on that one, they'd be like, oh my God, this is abhorrent. Cover up this, I think maybe a better lens is just to use the word forgiveness. And, basically, Jesus says you can't be forgiven yourself if you aren't able to extend that forgiveness to others. There's something about the nature of reality, the nature of being itself, that we have to forgive others. We have to be charitable, or we lock ourselves away from that same charity coming back to us. And it's kind of mysterious, but I think it's really true.
Yep. I think that's a good place to round it off, because that's a good thing to leave in all of our minds.
Awesome.
Yeah. What do you want to cover next time?
Yeah, I'd like to go. Maybe I can take some real time this week and dive deep in. I'm about maybe 30% through the book, so maybe I could wrap it up. I don't think it's a super long book, but I'm just going through it so slow.
Well, there's no
really deep.
There's no need to ingest the rest of the book, since I can only take in this much of it at a time anyway. Just pick out something some aspect of it that you want to talk about, and let me know what that aspect is, and I'll dig a little deeper. I didn't have as much time as I would have liked to pursue Barfield this week, because I had so many guests last week. I was supposed to parse them out over 2 weeks, but they had all canceled the previous week and all piled into last week. So last week I was treading water every day, but had a lot of great conversations. And so moving forward, we'll see you next week.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good. Thank you, Michael. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye, Karen.